In this video, I'll talk about the short story Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, by Jorge Luis Borges. This video has two main parts, one about what I think this story implies about language, and one part on what I think this story implies about art, especially contemporary art. But I have subdivided the video into more parts in order to make it clearer. Part 1. Summary of Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. In this story, the narrator was a friend of author Pierre Menard, who has just died, and so, to honor his friend, the narrator describes his visible work and then his invisible work. Menard was a French symbolist who dedicated himself to writing Don Quixote. The narrator tells us, "Those who have insinuated that Menard devoted his life to writing a contemporary Quixote besmirch his illustrious memory. Pierre Menard did not want to compose another Quixote, which surely is easy enough. He wanted to compose the Quixote. Nor, surely, need one have to say that his goal was never a mechanical transcription of the original. He had no intention of copying it. His admirable ambition was to produce a number of pages which coincided, word for word and line for line, with those of Miguel de Cervantes." Of course, Menard doesn't manage to finish his project, but still this has an impact on how his friend reads the Quixote. He says, "Shall I confess that I often imagine that he did complete it, and that I read the Quixote, the entire Quixote, as if Menard had conceived it?" And even though the two texts look exactly the same, the narrator sees many differences in meaning between them. He writes, "Menard's fragmentary Quixote is more subtle than Cervantes's. Cervantes crudely juxtaposes the humble provincial reality of his country against the fantasies of the romance, while Menard chooses as his reality the land of Carmen during the century that saw the Battle of Lepanto and the place of Lope da Vega. And so Menard's project has given readers new possibilities for enjoying a work of literature. The narrator tells us, "Menard has, perhaps unwittingly, enriched the slow and rudimentary art of reading by means of a new technique, the technique of deliberate anachronism and fallacious attribution." Part 2. Menard's view of language. In the list of Menard's visible work appear a symbolist sonnet, a transposition in Alexandrines of Paul Valéry's Cimetière Marin, a diatribe against Valéry, which states the exact reverse of Menard's true opinion of Valéry, who is his friend, and a monograph on the possibility of constructing a poetic vocabulary from concepts that are ideal objects created by convention essentially for the needs of poetry. Paul Valéry, whom Menard is said to have been friends with and admire, was very interested in mathematics as possessing a vocabulary precisely like this. He was looking for a self-contained language with a lot of precision that would allow a poet to solve a poem as one would an equation. It seems that this is what Menard was looking for. Some of his other work explores how a language of this sort could work. There is a monograph on affinities between the philosophies of Descartes, Leibniz, and John Wilkins, a monograph on Leibniz's Characteristics Universalis, and a monograph on Ramon Lull's Ars Magna Generalis. All these people were interested in building a language that could contain all of human thought and knowledge. Descartes and John Wilkins are mentioned in an essay by Borges called The Analytical Language of John Wilkins. In it, Borges writes, "In the universal language conceived by Wilkins, each word defines itself. Descartes had already noted in a letter that by using the decimal system of numeration, we could learn in a single day to name all quantities to infinity, and to write them in a new language, the language of numbers. He also proposed the formation of a similar general language that would organize and contain all human thought. Around 1664, John Wilkins began to undertake that task. You can see that mathematics is showing up again here. Leibniz's Characteristica Universalis is even more directly related to maths. He wanted his language to be a kind of universal calculus. Ideas would be proposed or disputed by precise calculations. Leibniz thought this would be possible because he considered that all our thoughts were built up of some more primitive thoughts. So we could build this universal calculus out of combinations of these primitive thoughts and arrive at all possible human ideas. Then, in Menard's works, there are drafts of a monograph on George Boull's symbolic logic, which translated a system of logic which was made out of a combination of phrases into an algebraic system, which allows one to manipulate ideas in a rigorous and abstract way, something similar to what Leibniz was looking for. After Boulle had made his contribution to logic, there was an attempt to base all of mathematics on logic and to justify all of the work that had been done on that basis. But then logic itself had to be justified, and how could that be done if not using logic itself? So a self-contained system of ideal objects seemingly can't be created in a way in which everything is fully justified and made rigorous. In the analytical language of John Wilkins, Borges writes, "Obviously, there is no classification of the universe that is not arbitrary and conjectural. The reason is very simple. We do not know what the universe is." And Borges finishes that essay with this quote by Chesterton. "Man knows that there are in the soul tints more bewildering, more numberless, and more nameless than the colors of an autumn forest. Yet he seriously believes that these things can every one of them, in all their tones and semitones, in all their blends and unions, be accurately represented by an arbitrary system of grunts and squeals." So Borges thought the language Menard was looking for probably couldn't be reached. So these ideas of a universal calculus indeed face a problem, which is a potential infinite regress. You always need a more primitive thought to build up the thought you're using to build yet another thought, and so on. In Menard's list of works, there is one that discusses the solutions that have been proposed to the problem of Achilles and the tortoise, which deals with the problem of infinite regress. Among the people who have proposed a solution to this conundrum is Leibniz. The paradox goes as follows. Achilles and a tortoise agree to race each other. Since Achilles is 10 times faster than the tortoise, he gives the tortoise 10 meters of advantage. Achilles runs those 10 meters and the tortoise runs 1. Achilles runs that meter, the tortoise runs 1 decimeter. Achilles runs that decimeter, the tortoise runs a centimeter, and so on to infinity, without ever reaching the tortoise. Borges wrote an essay about this paradox called Avatares de la Tortuga, or Avatars of the Tortoise. In it he mentions a use that Lewis Carroll makes of the paradox to point out that, to make sure we accept the conclusion of a syllogism, we need yet another rule, which then works as a new syllogism, leading to infinite regress. It describes an endless dialogue between Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles proposes: A. Two things which are both equal to a third thing are equal to each other. And B. The two sides of this triangle are equal to line MN. Z. The two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. The tortoise accepts premises A and B, but denies that they would justify the conclusion, Z. So Achilles asks him to consider a new proposition. A. Two things which are both equal to a third thing are equal to each other. B. The two sides of this triangle are equal to line MN. C. If A and B are valid, then Z is valid. Z. The two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. Now the tortoise accepts A, B, and C, but not Z. Indignant, Achilles affirms, D. If A, B, and C are valid, then Z is valid. So, to build mathematics from scratch would be impossible. Even worse would be the creation of a universal calculus. Any self-contained language made out of ideal objects would be impossible to get to. So Menard's ideal language seems impossible to reach. And this is probably why Menard was interested in the proposed solutions to this problem, to this paradox, and why Russell is among the people who appear in this work of Menard's, because he attempted to give a solution specifically to Carroll's version of the paradox. If we look at Menard's visible work, we see that he didn't produce any fiction and wrote very few poems. Most of his works showed an interest in language, the possibility of this ideal language and the rules of our regular languages, and also the possibilities of chess, which is a self-contained game with clear and strict rules created by convention. So it seems like his main interest was in this type of language, chess being a kind of manifestation of it, not really in writing fiction. So why exactly did he decide to write the Quixote? Menard wrote to the narrator saying, the final term, the conclusion of a theological or metaphysical proof about, say, the objective world, God, causation, Platonic forms, is just as foregone and familiar as my well-known novel. The sole difference is that philosophers publish pleasant volumes containing the intermediate stages of their work, while I am resolved to suppress those stages of my own. From this I understood that Menard thinks Don Quixote is as inevitable as proving that the objective world exists in a metaphysical proof, and perhaps that Menard considers his invisible work to be a kind of metaphysical proof, perhaps one that would fit well with the solutions to the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise that he wrote about. Menard said, every man should be capable of all ideas, and I believe that in the future he shall be. If he had arrived at the Quixote independently, that would have shown that every man could have come up with these ideas. But of course, the inspirations for these ideas would have been different. So this would show that the thoughts of Cervantes and the thoughts of Menard were both built up of primitive thoughts that all humans have access to, something like what Leibniz believed. So perhaps Menard's project would refute the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Schopenhauer, who Borges liked to read, wrote, art, the work of genius, repeats and reproduces the eternal ideas grasped through pure contemplation, the essential and abiding in all the phenomena in the world. But of course, Menard doesn't finish the Quixote. He had even admitted it to be impossible. He said, the task I have undertaken is not in essence difficult. If I could just be immortal, I could do it. So he doesn't really succeed in proving his thesis this way, but perhaps by opening up new ways of reading, by allowing the attribution of the Quixote to people other than Cervantes, he has made it so that every man is capable of every thought. In Avatars of the Tortoise, Borges writes that to refute the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise is to contaminate oneself with irreality. And sure enough, in Menard's visible work appears a foreword to the catalogue of an exhibit of lithographs by Carolus Hauerkade, who doesn't exist. Menard's Quixote shows that the words that Cervantes wrote don't have a fixed meaning. If they had been written in a different context, their meaning would have been different. So apparently words aren't completely connected to the material objects they sometimes refer to. They depend on how we see that object at a particular time in history. So it seems that to some extent, words refer to concepts, abstract ideas of objects. So in this sense, our language is already somewhat close to what Menard was looking for. Valéry rejected the idea that a text has a singular, definitive meaning. So perhaps Menard was showing the seeds to the language he was looking for in our own language. Part 3. How history affected the Quixote. In this craft of verse, Borges is talking about the effects of time on poetry when he says, "Let us take the title of one of the most famous books in the world, Historia del ingenioso hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha." The word hidalgo has today a peculiar dignity all of its own. Yet when Cervantes wrote it, the word hidalgo meant a country gentleman. As for the name Quixote, it was meant to be a rather ridiculous word, like the names of many of the characters in Dickens: Pickwick, Swiveller, Chuzzlewit, Twist, Squares, Quilp, and so on. And then you have de la Mancha, which now sounds noble and Castilian to us. But when Cervantes wrote it, he intended it to sound perhaps as if he had written Don Quixote of Kansas City. You see how these words have been ennobled. You see a strange fact, that because the old soldier Miguel de Cervantes poked mild fun at La Mancha, now La Mancha is one of the everlasting words of literature. So history itself had already changed the meaning of Quixote. The only thing that maintained something close to the original meaning was our choice to interpret the story closely to what was likely to have been the author's intention. Some symbolists saw Quixote as similar to a symbolist poet, obstinately looking for beauty in an ugly world. With time, it seems Quixote was seen in a more romantic way, and perhaps Menard's Quixote has this connotation. In Cervantes' time, cavalry romances were very popular, and Cervantes was contrasting them to the humble reality of his day. But in Menard's time, cavalry novels had already been demolished by Cervantes, and the reality that Menard chooses is not in fact his reality, which would be the 20th century France, but is a land that he knows through works of art, such as Carmen and the works of Lope de Vega. So Menard's Quixote is perhaps more similar to the simplist's idea of Quixote. So in this way, Menard would be similar to Quixote in his quest for an impossible project in order to prove the possibility of an impossible language. In the beginning of this story, the narrator sounds very pompous and a bit crazy. After all, he starts the text with these words: "The visible oeuvre left by this novelist can be easily and briefly enumerated. Unpardonable, therefore, are the omissions and additions perpetrated by Madame Henri Bachelier in a deceitful catalogue that a certain newspaper, whose Protestant leanings are surely no secret, has been so inconsiderate as to inflict upon that newspaper's deplorable readers, few and Calvinist, if not Masonic and circumcised, though they be. Menard's true friends have greeted that catalogue with alarm, and even with a degree of sadness. One might note that only yesterday were we gathered before his memorial place of rest, among the dreary cypresses, and already error, with capital E, is attempting to tarnish his bright memory, with capital M. Most decidedly, a brief rectification is imperative. Then he goes on to praise his friend's crazy idea of writing the Quixote from his own experiences, and says this new Quixote is much better than the original. He sounds kind of crazy. It seems as if Borges is mocking people like him. He sounds perhaps a bit like Quixote. But as the story unfolds, we see that he has a point, and he starts to speak more like a normal person. This reflects also on Menard himself, who seems rather pretentious and not very connected to the real world in the beginning of the story, but then really does make an interesting contribution with this project. At a certain point in the story, the narrator tells us that Menard thought it could be interesting, though of contradictory and superficial execution, to attempt what Daudet had famously suggested: conjoin in a single figure both the ingenious gentleman, Don Quixote, and his squire. I think the narrator of this story, and Menard himself, might be that figure. Part 6. Authorship and the role of the reader. In medieval times, it was common for the author of a text to sign it with the name of a famous and important philosopher. The idea was that this showed that the text was inserted in a particular tradition, and also to confer that text with more credibility and importance. The author only gained more importance during Romanticism. In the beginning of the Quixote, the narrator explains that he has collected old texts containing the story of a man called Quixote, or Quijada, or Quesada. It varies with the author. This was often the way that cavalry romances were presented in order to make the contents of the book seem more reliable, like it was a real story. Then, at the end of the chapter 8, the narrator stops the story in the middle of a battle and says that the original manuscript has finished there and that he hadn't found a text continuing the story. In chapter 9, which Menard is said to have attempted, the narrator says he found some old notebooks in a market and sees it is in Arabic, so he gets an Arab translator to help him. The narrator then says that Arabs are known to be liars. In those days, the Arabs were enemies of the Spanish. And this casts doubts on whether the text is true. So Cervantes was already playing with the notion that who we consider to be the author influences the way we see the text. So the notion that changing the ascribed author changes the meaning of a text is an old one. But Borges goes a step further. He allows the reader to change who he considers the author to be. He puts the reader in charge of the meaning of the text. In this craft of verse, Borges says, "For what is a book in itself? A book is a physical object in a world of physical objects. It is a set of dead symbols, and then the right reader comes along, and the words, or rather the poetry behind the words, for the words themselves are mere symbols, spring to life, and we have a resurrection of the word. So the reader is the one who gives meaning to the text." Before Borges said that, Paul Valéry already thought that the author was not the final authority on the meaning of the text, that the reader actively created the final meaning in his own mind. But the notion that the reader could change the narrative around the text and therefore create new meanings for the same words is, I think, really new. Part 7. Menard and Contemporary Art. In the book The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, Arthur Danto asked the reader to consider a collection of paintings. One of them is the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. It's a square of red paint. Another element of the collection is Red Square, a clever bit of Moscow landscape. The other one is a minimalist exemplar of geometrical art, which is also called Red Square. The next element is called Nirvana. It is also a square of red paint. Then there is an object that is not really an artwork, merely a canvas grounded in red lead, upon which, had he lived to execute it, Giorgione would have painted an unrealized masterwork, and the last object is simply a surface painted in red lead, which is also not an artwork. Danto relates this collection to the short story we're talking about, Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, and asks us to see that these paintings are different, even though they all look exactly the same. I found this interesting because through Menard's work we see that the Quixote is not the text itself. It's of course not each book that represents it, and we might even consider a different author for it. In the case of the red squares of paint, it seems that the meaning of them is not in them, but is in the narrative behind them, which is seen mainly through the title or knowledge about the painter. In this book, Danto is searching for a way of defining art that allows for what art became after Duchamp and after Warhol's Brillo boxes. These artists put ordinary objects in a museum, and suddenly they gained a different meaning. If the meaning of the art is not in the object itself, then an object can gain a different meaning when it's put in a different context. If the meaning of a work of art is not in the object, it's now in the narrative around that object. When it was made, by whom it was made, what is thought of its maker, and so on. In Borges' story, this gives the reader the power to create meaning. But in the art we see in museums, this often gives the power to create meaning to curators and experts who have this important information and who are the ones who present a work of art to the viewer. Perhaps this is why we often see in museums exhibitions which have been completely conceptualized by curators and that center around the messages of the work of art, much more than on their form or on the way they move art forward. The movie The Hypothesis of the Stolen Painting by Raul Ruiz mocks how narratives around works of art can often be thought of by experts, sometimes completely alienated from the real history of those works. If you like Pierre Menard, author of Quixote, you may like this movie. I think it's a good companion. So, if the meaning of a work of art is not in the object itself, what does that mean for forgery? A painting made by a forger that looks exactly the same as the original has a different narrative attached to it. It wasn't the creative act that the original was, though it shows an impressive artistic ability. If it's not known that it's a forgery, then it is worth a lot. The value is attached not to the appearance of the object, but to its author. Forgers often create completely new works, but in the style of a famous painter, and then sign them as that famous painter, changing the history of that painter's thoughts and the history of art. The painting gains importance and therefore value simply because of the signature in it, and the way this happens is through the validation of experts, through the narrative that the experts invent for that painting to explain how it fits into the ideas of the famous painter. The movie F for Fake by Orson Welles shows how one of the main art forgers of the 20th century, Elmire de Rori, deceived and made a mockery out of experts in this way. Elmire says that if a painting is hung in an art gallery and stays there for a long time, it's art. We saw in the case of the Red Square paintings that if one of them is presented as art, then it is. But another painting that looks exactly the same, but is not presented as art, is not art. Elmire's biographer says he showed a particular painting to one art expert, telling him it was a fake. And then the expert pointed out all the obvious defects. Later he showed the same painting to another expert, telling him it was authentic, and then the expert said, "Of course it is. It's one of the painter's finest works." F for Fake is another movie that I think you would like if you like this short story. So, the idea that the meaning of an artwork is not entirely in the object allows for interesting works of art that would never have been considered art if it wasn't this way. And it can give a lot of power to the viewer. But it can also give lots of power to art experts, and it perhaps explains some very uninteresting recent exhibitions I've seen, which are not really concerned with the shape and form of the art, but only with its potential messages. I have seen artworks in museums that depended almost entirely on the support text written by the curator for meaning. The work itself was quite uninteresting and said very little on its own. Often the text gave the works some relevant political connotations, and that seemed to be enough to consider the work itself relevant. So I think this is a possible downside of this way of seeing art. So this is what I thought about Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. I'd love to know what you thought. You can leave your thought here in the comments.